Yeah, if you can't tell yet, I want to do this one a little bit differently. I want to go through and, normally questions kind of come in over the webcast channel. We kind of filter through them, and, ones that we can answer or think are relevant, we kind of push through. Other ones sometimes kind of get missed. We can only kind of push things through so fast. I want to kind of change that up a little bit. So the whole reason for having the Discord server was to kind of facilitate more communication between people. We don't need to be that traffic cop in the middle of conversations between people. So that link at the bottom is an invitation to join a Discord channel. There's also a link in the webcast chat, so feel free to go ahead and leverage that. And we've got we've got multiple areas set up, but there's two that we'll be using today. One is the ACM webcast chat. Any questions you have, any feedback you want to give, I got some questions I'm asking as we're going through this. If you want to answer those, hey, that's the place to do it. If you have like general stuff like, hi, I'm here from X place, coffee shop area is a great one for that. So there's a kind of a general banter and something to kind of focus more on what we're talking about here. There's also a webcast content channel. There's already a copy of the slides up there. So you don't have to wait a week or two to be able to get a copy of this content. You can go up and you can grab that right now. And I started off kind of doing a generic kind of, this is how you do threat hunting. And I'll be honest, I kind of got a little frustrated. And I got a little frustrated because I look at what we're doing in the industry. And, I've been at this for a while. I realize we've been doing this for a while. And what we're doing is really broken. And I think I kind of pivoted this to kind of want to talk about why it's broken. Why do we keep doing broken things? And I want to kind of dive into that a little bit. This is going to be a prime webcast for cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is we have an opinion, so we tend to kind of collect and focus the data to kind of reinforce how we already feel. And I think that a lot of the problems we have today in the industry are kind of based on cognitive bias. They're kind of based, well, I think there's two problems. One is we're all addicted to dopamine, and that kind of drives us to continually doing things that don't necessarily pay off. But that's a whole other webcast if we wanted to do that at some point. But the other is cognitive bias. We've been kind of doing it this way, so we feel like, this is the way to do it. And how do we do it today? Well, today the way to do it is to have a SIEM, do centralized logging, collect logs from all your systems. We're told, collect as much data as possible. Usually the centralized logging vendor that charges by the amount of storage is the one telling you, yes, you must record everything, get everything into your SIEM, get it all recorded, and then write up some signatures to look for the bad stuff, like, oh, hey, look, there's a bunch of failed logins coming from this IP. You got to worry about that. So we go in, we write signatures to go in and kind of match on this stuff. When our signatures find something, we get some sort of an alert, and then we go in and we kind of follow up on those alerts. And for a lot of folks, this is what they think is threat hunting. It's not, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. But as far as how do we figure out when our protections failed, this is the process we've been using. So this is kind of based around syslog. And I don't want to go too far down this note, but I think it's important to kind of understand what our limitations are here. So syslog has been around for a long time. It's got two different parts to it. There's the header, which is, hey, this is when this message was created and this is where it came from. And then there is the description of this is the process that generated this log entry and here's what it looks like. When this goes out across the wire, there's a priority number identified. I have that circled in red here. Your priority is just a combination of the facility and the priority. Or excuse me, the facility and the severity. So basically priority equals facility times 8 plus your severity level. So here we've got 38, so that would be a facility of 4, that's authentication. We'd end up with a remainder of 6, so that would tell us this is informational. So how do we know what kind of log entry this is? It's that priority number that goes through and tells us that. Now, we get some limitations here. One is there's a facility called security, but it's not a generic security bucket. It's for specifically log auditing software that's running on the system. Really what we need is a severity level of security. If we could label all of our applications anytime something happens that's security related, if that was a severity level like informational or emergency or whatever the case may be, that would be helpful. But hey, we don't have that. So we can't use priority to go in and filter on things that are actually important to us. So we fall back on message context. We fall back on, hey, what's the context of that message set? And that's all over the place. There's no standards for that. So I went through at one point and tried to create some signatures for like Apache running on Linux that took me months because there was no documentation, or no documentation to help me in this aspect. And then I went to go look at like Apache on Windows, and all the log entries are different. So it's all over the place to go in and try and grab this stuff. My other concern with logging is it's a failed open system. By what I mean by that is you can have a system on your network that it could potentially become compromised because it's got internet access, and the fact that it's not generating logging doesn't generate an alert, doesn't prevent it from doing those communications. In other words, you can kind of think of a firewall as more of a failed closed system, in that anytime somebody wants to go to the internet, they're going to go through the firewall. The firewall is going to record that. But if I'm collecting system logs, I can get to the internet without generating system logs to a central logging server, no problem. So our ability to be able to actually see everything that's on the wire is diminished, and there's no easy trigger to identify for us that we're actually not seeing everything. We could think we're logging everything, and then we're actually not. And oh, by the way, bad guys go in and shut the logs off all the time. So if they go in and they shut the logs off, or if they filter out their application, we still have no trigger for that. So we're in a centralized logging server writing signatures to find stuff that might not be being submitted by the server, and even if it is, the bad guys might be filtering that out. And this is our way to try and find bad guys, huh? So and a lot of this is based around signatures. We're going in and looking for some pattern within those messages. Well, this is 1990s antivirus, right? Legacy antivirus was look for this string of code within an executable. If you see it, label it as being this type of virus. If someone goes in and makes a change, we don't detect it that way anymore. Go back 15 plus years, and I taught a class at SANS, SANS at Night class, on how to modify malware to be able to circumvent antivirus. And what we did is we took something simple like Netcat, and we ran it through about 5 or 6 different AV systems. And, we saw in class that, hey, look, all the AV systems identify it as Netcat and that it's bad. And then we went in with a binary editor, and we just changed the help file. The -H information that gets printed out, we just went in and changed that, and everything but like 1 or 2 AV software packages stopped detecting it. It was still Netcat. It could still do everything Netcat would do. It just called it Dogcat or something like that when you use the -H switch, and everybody all of a sudden starts missing it. We made one other minor change that didn't affect the connectivity, and all of a sudden everything else missed it. So this, looking for things based on signature, it's great when everything matches that signature. If it's not matching the signature, we're going to miss it. And again, this is what we're relying on to kind of find the bad guys. And we've been at this for a while. Centralized logging is probably one of our oldest security tools that we have available. It was created in '87. It started to take off around 1990. I wanted to look at like, hey, so what was the big thing, popular thing at that time? And it was, MC Hammer doing Hammer Time. So the parachute pants you see here. Now, would you wear parachute pants today? Oh my God, I hope you wouldn't, right? We've evolved and we've changed off of that. Yet logging really hasn't. We're doing the same thing. We're using a syslog format to record messages and pattern match on a string in there to find known vulnerabilities, and that's it. And this just doesn't really fly for us anymore. So a question I kind of want to throw... Buckfutter says, I would wear those pants right now. Well, hey, that's one of the nice things about working from home, right? Is that you could wear something like this and, no one is going to notice. But I do want to throw a couple of questions around this, which is, if you're doing this, do you have a way to see if this is actually working? Meaning you've gone in and you've written signatures. Great. What if there's a slight variation? Are you still going to catch it? Is anybody doing testing to validate they can actually catch variations of stuff? Like one of the common tests I see is you hire a red team. So a red team will try to go in, break into your network, They'll see if they can't, get access to a system, and if they do you detect them? Do you detect the command and control channel they set up? If not, you need to go in and make changes. Have folks tried this? And if you have, great. What's worked for you? Please share that in the Discord channel. It would be great to get some ideas around that. And I'm going to keep things moving because we kind of fell back a little bit. So I'm talking a lot about centralized logging being broken, that we're using this to try and find the bad guys, but everybody does it, and every security attestation requires it, so it must work, right? Well, no. There is a ton of data out there to tell us this is just not working. When you look at the industry average for how long does it take from when a system gets broken into to when that breach gets detected, the industry average is over 6 months. Sometimes it's faster, obviously. Sometimes it's a whole lot longer. I mean, Starwood was 4.5 years, and that may not even be the worst. That's actually not the worst case I've heard of. So once folks get in, they go undetected for a long period of time. And what the data tells us is a majority of the time, once they finally do get detected, it's not by the organization that got compromised. It's by some sort of outside entity. Again, pick on Starwood. It was a bank that correlated multiple credit cards that got compromised and saw the one thing they all had in common was staying at Starwood. That was what actually led to identifying that a compromise took place. So we're not catching them for a long period of time, and when we do, we're not catching them ourselves. The 2019 Verizon breach report. I've mentioned this one before, and if you haven't read it, it's worth it. Hey, we're all on isolation. You got free time now, right? This is the time to go read this breach report. Because when you read between the lines, there's some really scary data in there. Things like 2.5% of the time, we catch things with our system logs. Oh my God. I mean, that's like, if your organization gets compromised 50 times, you'll catch the bad people once. No, that just doesn't work, right? No, that is, we can't live with that. The other one that was really frightening to me was that out of all the incidences they investigated, when a point of sale system was compromised, that system that processes credit card transactions, exactly 0 of them were detected internally. 100% of them, when they were finally detected, was detected by an outside third party. Well, wait a minute. Logging's a requirement in PCI, right? If you're processing credit cards, you have auditors coming in to make sure you're collecting system logs and have signatures to go check it. And oh crap, this still doesn't work. So we got a problem here, a huge problem here. 6 months plus. Maybe the 50th time we get broken into, we'll detect it ourselves. That's just not as cool. So there's some problems here we need to fix. And one of the other things I want to kind of throw out here for discussion are how do you convey risk to upper management? In other words, this is a problem. This is a big hole. You've got firewalls, IDSs, and we may need to go to upper management and say, hey, we've spent a lot of money on our protection schemes like firewalls and IDS. We've spent money on incident handling and doing forensics. There's this big gaping hole in the middle. How do you convey that in a way they'll understand? How do you put that in the context of overall business risk? And what I mean by that is if we have a problem, right, and we go to our CEOs, CIOs, whoever, and say, weak security, bad, must spend more money, that doesn't say anything to them. We've got to put it in overall risk context. You've got the legal department going to them, talking to them about, hey, if we don't resolve this problem, we might get sued. You have support going to them saying, hey, if we don't solve this problem, we might lose customers. Sales is going there saying, hey, if we don't do this, we won't get in new customers. So our security risks get evaluated as a business risk with all of those other competing features. So when you present this to upper management, it has to kind of include that. And I'd be curious if people have had successful, hey, this is what I've did. So for example, what I've done with an organization is I've gone in and I've done 2 things. One is I've hooked in with legal, and I've made sure that legal recognizes security risks in the context of overall business risk. And that way I can turn them into an advocate for our cause. And I've also worked with sales to see how security may be able to help improve the sales process. I've actually gotten companies to agree that we were sales enablement, not overhead, and start funding security accordingly. I was able to go in and show that, hey, this group of customers we wouldn't have gotten without these security practices. And this sales process would not, we cut 3 months out of the sales cycle just by implementing good security. We're closing sales that much faster. That's a great way to go through and get money funding. If folks have done similar, please share that in the Discord channel, because we all need as much help as we can get here. So, is log review threat hunting? Let me kind of cycle back into this. Just to kind of review what I've talked about, we're using a protocol that wasn't designed to describe security events that fails in an open state, meaning that things can get compromised and we'll never see it. We're using 1990 technology within that platform to try and find the bad guys. No, this isn't threat hunting. Threat hunting is supposed to be a proactive compromise assessment. Are my systems in a pristine shape or not, yes or no? And this isn't giving us that by any stretch of the imagination. So this process is broken. We need to come up with some better ideas. I'm not saying system logs are useless. I'm saying it may not be the best choice for finding the threats. Now, once we identify a threat, once I can say, hey, this other technology is showing me that 192.168.1.100 is acting suspiciously. Oh, hey, let's system log the heck out of that box and make sure we get a good understanding of what's going on. So I think in a forensics aspect, these system logs are really helpful. To actually find the bad people, oh my God, we've got hundreds of millions of log entries we're looking at where you're trying to use static patterns to find the bad stuff. It's just not flying. Now, what a lot of folks have done is they've said, oh, that's okay. Yeah, I do the system logging, but I'm using threat intel feeds, so I'm good. Well, wait a minute. What's a threat intel feed? A threat intel feed is some third party saying, do not trust this IP address or fully qualified domain name because it's bad. What does that mean, right? So number one, we're back to pattern matching. We're saying if you see this IP or this host name, it's bad, don't talk to it. And it's still that 1990s AV technology, right? Because the way 1990 AV technology worked is my system got infected, they would write a signature, push that out to the rest of their customers, and now if it ends up on somebody else's network, you detect it. Well, when the goal was mass propagation, that made a lot of sense. When propagation was slow, because hey, 1990s, we didn't have a whole lot of bandwidth, even worse than we have today with our server here. That worked fine. But today, attackers are customizing their attacks and their sources every time they hit a new target. So trying to filter out something they did 6 months ago doesn't necessarily help me out. Problem number one for me, we're still using 1990s AV technology. This isn't going to fly. Problem number two, what's the source of this banned list? Because how good that list is depends on the people that are behind it. And here's a great example of that. Bing doesn't get a whole lot of love. People tend to forget it's still a web crawler out there, just like Google, which means they still have bots, which means they're still trying to index all the websites on the internet. And yet, here's a threat intel feed that actually records why were these entries created and how long have they been there for and how often do they get reported. And you can see this particular IP address looks pretty bad. It's had, 142 negative reports from 115 different sources in a short period of time, which sounds bad. But now when you start looking at why, oh, just block it. Oh, it's running all my JavaScripts and I don't understand why. Well, no, that's what a web crawl is supposed to do, right? So you're banning this thing for being a bot because it's supposed to be a bot, So, so how good is that intel? That really draws into it. And how old is that intel really draws into this too. When you look at where are the attacks originating, a lot of it's coming out of shared space. So it's an IP address that runs 50 different web servers, or it's running in the infrastructure as a service of some cloud provider, which, and I'm not going to pick on any one because I've seen them out of multiple. It came from a shared IP. So if you're telling me that, 5.79.79.211, we just saw hostile activity from it 30 minutes ago, sure, I'll go in and I'll add that to my ban list, no problem. If this is here because it happened 6 months ago, that information is useless to me. I worked for a registrar for a period of time. And, one of the things I saw was attackers are changing up their attack tactics and their sources at least every week, sometimes multiple times a week. So by the time this ends up in a database and then gets pushed out to you, that information is usually useless. I kind of have a question because I've gotten hits off of intel feeds, where it's kind of, I've seen an IP address that showed up on the list and it says, oh, hey, yeah, we blocked this because, hey, it's on a known to be bad list. Has anybody actually identified a compromise this way? In other words, have you gone into a network, matched against an intel list, saw an internal system was sending a lot of data to it and realized, oh, wait, that system was compromised? If so, what process did you use? Because the results can be a little misleading, meaning that if I go to my firewall and I ban all those IP addresses and I see that, oh, sometimes that IP tried to get to me and sometimes my system tried to get to that IP, and I feel like the threat intel list is working because somebody tried and I stopped it, that's not necessarily a true statement. It may be an entry from months ago and I'm actually blocking legitimate traffic. Has anybody actually done the work to figure out, no, I'm only looking at it when it's actually known to be compromising systems, and yeah, this has actually paid off to me. If you could share your process and maybe even what you're using as a feed, that would be super helpful. So we've talked about centralized system logging. We've talked about threat intel feeds. Let's talk about threat hunting. What's this supposed to be? This is supposed to be a proactive validation of all the systems on your network, not just your desktops, not just the systems running Windows. It's supposed to be everything. So, if you've got Cisco routers, if you have Bob's router, whatever, you want to be able to validate those too. When we started Active Countermeasures, one of our first alpha customers grabbed the software, got it running in their network, came back to us and said, hey, we've got 3 IP addresses that look really suspicious. Can you help us run this down? We think we got a compromised system. And sure enough, it was beaconing traffic. There was C2 traffic going back to Guangzhou, China. And that was one of the things that kind of set off a red flag for them was they said, gee, these 3 IP addresses are talking to Guangzhou, China. We don't have a field office or a business partner there. That might be a problem. Long story short, their facilities team had bought 3 IP-based cameras off of Amazon, and at no additional cost, they came pre-compromised by the manufacturer. So, no one had to break into it. It was that way from the vendor, and it was immediate. You plugged it in, and it immediately started taking screen caps of your network and sending them off to Guangzhou, China. There was no system logging. So if I'm using a SIM to go through and try and find a possible compromise on my network, I'm never going to see that. So, again, we need something that'll cover everything. Execute without making assumptions. What I mean by that is I see a lot of cases where folks will say, okay, we're going to test our threat hunting capability. So here's what I'm going to do. I know we have a signature to catch DNS cat or to catch some other command and control channel. So let's test that specifically. Well, gee, great. That's nice. It's a good way to make sure the signature works the way you want to. But what if they don't use DNSCAT? What if they use some other type of C2 over DNS? Can you still catch that as well? So when you do your testing, when you go after systems, you need to go through and you need to do it without making any assumptions. Well, you can't use what is already in place to kind of drive what type of testing you do. Then you're simply doing validation of a signature, not validation of the entire system, and it's the system we need to be able to go in and validate. And the output from a threat hunt should be a compromise assessment. It should be some documentation that says, I feel pretty certain for these specific reasons, all of our systems are in a non-compromised state. That's not something you get out of daily alerts in a SIEM. It's not something you get out of a pen test. It's not something you get out of a vulnerability scan. Something that says, I think we are in a clean state today. That's what the goal of a threat hunt should be.
Hey, Chris?
Yes.
There was a question a few minutes ago that I was hoping you could answer.
Go for it.
Someone asked, what is your advice on using natural language processing for this? And they said for threat intel example to make it specific to you.
In the context of threat intel or in the context of writing signatures?
Both, I guess. Both. Yep, they said both.
Both, okay. Threat intel, it's that kind of comes down to who is your source and what are they using to collect this information. It really kind of comes down to how much work goes into feeding those IP addresses to you. And what I've seen a lot of times is not necessarily a lot of work in that. Again, one of the most helpful things to me off of a threat intel list would be first seen, last seen is negative for an IP address. Because again, if it happened 10 minutes ago, yeah, I care. If it happened 3 months ago, 6 months ago, even if it happened 2 weeks ago, I don't care. Whoever the bad guy was using that IP, they've moved on from there. They're using something else by now. And when you get into a cloud environment, that becomes really easy to do because most environments reboot the system or just shut it down and turn it back on. You've got a different IP. Now somebody else picks up that IP and they, go pick on them instead type of thing. So in that context, you're okay. As far as like writing signature goes to kind of go through your SIM, it really kind of comes down to like, what is it you're searching on and how large of a false positive rate can you deal with? Think about like failed logins. You can go in and you can write something that says, hey, show me all failed logins. And yeah, you'll see all failed logins, but a lot of those are going to be false positives. It's going to be users fat fingering their password. So how do you fix that? Well, one of the ways we try to fix it is we go in and we say, all right, look for 3 failed logins or more than 3 failed logins followed by a successful. Okay, that'll drop the false positive rating, but we're still going to see some. And then you could argue it's more something to worry about because they did eventually get in. But you're still going to run into false positives because a failed login, especially today, does not necessarily mean you're under attack. It just means somebody got a password wrong. So a little bit more, it's not just a natural language thing. It's almost like you got to introduce some behavioral analytics to this whole thing as well. So I don't know if that completely answers the question, but I kind of hit on both, so hopefully it does. Our goal is to go through and do a compromise assessment. Our goal is to go through and identify, is every system in a pristine state, yes or no? Well, that kind of drives what our job description is, right? Because our job description is to look at every single system attached to the organization's network and come up with one of 2 possible outcomes. I'm pretty certain the system's safe, or I'm pretty certain the system's compromised. I've got a third possibility listed here, but it really links back to the first 2, which is I can't tell. I can't say for certain that it's safe. I can't say for certain it's compromised, which means I need to collect more data and end up with one of those first 2 dispositions. So it always comes back to those first 2. Is it safe or not? Yes or no? And while that sounds really simple, deriving at that from an authoritative perspective, meaning that I'm not just guessing, I actually have decent data to tell me if everything's safe or not, is not that easy to do. I see a lot of job descriptions for threat hunters that, quite honestly, it's forensics. You start getting into, trying to do attrition and figure out who the bad guys are and what exactly they did on the system. No. That's a forensics person's job. A threat hunter, is the system compromised, yes or no? And as I said, we got a 6-month lead time, and it's usually identified by an outside third party. Oh, this job description, even though it's simple, is tough enough as it is, because that's a huge problem we need to be able to solve right now. We need to start someplace that allows us to catch everything. We talked about one of the problems with centralized logging is not everything's going to collect logs. Attackers can shut that off. You can get internet access without submitting your logs to a centralized logging system. So how do we get around that? Well, I mentioned one possibility is, firewalls. Firewalls see everything. Can't get to the internet without going through the firewall. So maybe we go in and start watching traffic for that. So what kind of traffic are we looking for? An overwhelming majority of the attacks that take place have some form of command and control component. They have some sort of C2 channel, meaning the attacker gets malware on a system, and that could be a desktop, that could be an IoT device. Some internal endpoint gets compromised, and they need a command and control channel in order to be able to do things with it. Whether that's, steal your customer information, leverage that as a resource as part of a botnet, go after and, steal trade secrets, whatever it is they want to do, they need some way to control that malware. That's C2. That's going to flow out to the internet. That's something we can go in and target. Because C2 does act differently than a regular user. Users are opportunistic. I need to go to Google now, I will. I need to go to this website now, I will. I need to run SSH for now, right now, and I will, and then I'll stop when I'm done. It's very opportunistic in its nature. When you talk about C2, you're talking about a channel that will stay open 24 hours a day, in order to facilitate communications anytime the bad person on the other end needs to forward through some sort of commands. So that could be a long connection where they just hold it open all the time, or they could just have the thing call home like once per second or once per minute or whatever the time interval happens to be. So if we go in and we target that C2, now we're not dealing with as many false positives. There's some, yeah, like NTP can look like a C2 beacon channel, but hey, we know it does, so we can go through and whitelist that out pretty easily. But it allows us to see everything, regardless of whether it's a desktop or an internal system. It gives us that full visibility, and it allows us to, if we can't say definitively, yes, it's compromised or no, it's not, oh, it can get us an awful lot of the way there. And then from there, we can pivot to our system logs. Well, that's kind of cool, because originally what we talked about we were trying to do with our system logs was look for known bad patterns that other people have seen before. Now what we're talking about doing is saying, hey, that system is acting suspicious right now. I need to go in and I need to focus in on that system right now. So let me look at all the log entries generated from that system right now, but that system versus any others that are on there. Well, now we've gone from 150 million log entries that we need to try and parse through to whatever is just associated with that system, and that's it. One of the things I kind of wanted to bring up and have people kind of toss into the discussion channel as well is, would you describe your security process as agile? By that I mean, does it welcome change? Does it have defined deliverables? Is there a focus on improvement? One example. So, we do make a threat hunting product. Full disclosure, I think everybody probably knows that by now. But one of the things we're obsessive about is how do we reduce the time it takes to do a threat hunt? In other words, it's not just, hey, let's do this, and if people can't figure it out, they got to get smarter and kind of call it a day at that. We're constantly focused on, all right, if I have 1,000 internal IPs, how long does it take for me to do this hunt? Where is a lot of that time going? Is there a way I can shorten the cycle on that timing so I can make this hunt take longer? When we started this effort about 2 years ago, going through and doing a threat hunt on like 1,000 endpoints was probably about a week and a half worth of analyst time. We've got that down now to where it's like a day, maybe two, if they're not familiar with the environment, and that's it. And we're still continuing to make improvements. So being agile within our insecurity is really super important. And it's quite honestly, it's something we're not very good at. We tend to be very conservative, and we tend to be, well, this is the way we've always done it, so we're going to keep doing it this way. And what I kind of wanted to reach out to is, are there folks out there who feel like they're more agile, that hit a lot of the bullets that are on here, especially the measured improvements in the process? And what are some of the things that work with you? Could you jump into the Discord channel and share that with everybody? That would be really cool. So where do we start? So we're talking about, all right, so we want a threat hunt. We want to find the bad guys. Where do we start? Like I said, that network is the great equalizer. Start with a day's worth of content. Now, I know that sounds like a lot. Oh my God, how am I going to get a 24-hour PCAP to load up in Wireshark? Well, good luck with that. It probably won't. But there's other tools we can pull in, like Zeek. Zeek is awesome. Zeek is one of my top 3 favorite security open source tools, because it can take a lot of traffic, compact it down to a small area, and still go through and find all sorts of really cool things, like beaconing traffic, like long connections, like where it looks like data is being exfiltrated out of the environment, things of that nature. So a good block of traffic, and then do an analysis from IP to IP for every connection that takes place. That's where we start. And the first thing we want to go in and take a look for is, do we see C2? Do we see command and control? Because if not, don't bother. Who cares if the user agent is unique? Who cares if this thing talked to an IP address that's using a self-signed digital certificate or a digital certificate expired? If it doesn't look like command and control, who cares? That's a different problem. But if it looks like C2, okay, now we go down the rabbit hole. Now we look at, is there anything odd in that protocol and the way it's being used? Is there anything odd about that external IP? Is there anything weird going on with the internal IP? There's a process we can go through and follow. So imagine we have 100,000 internal systems we're trying to deal with. How many are having a persistent connection with an IP address out on the internet? Well, that's probably going to filter out 95,000 of those 100,000. Great, now we only got 5,000 hosts to work with, but there's still 5,000. So what do we do next? How much of this looks like it's abnormal traffic? How much of this is, hey, I see traffic going to TCP 443. It should be HTTPS. but there's no SSL hello packet going by. There's no SSLO server packet going by. There's no digital certificate exchange. Okay, that's an abuse of the protocol in a well-known port. That's something worth taking a look at. So we can drill this down very quickly and get to our disposition. And our disposition is it safe, yes or no? Now, if we figured out way back at persistency of connection that it was safe, we're done. If we saw something that looked persistent, let's say we saw a system talking to an NTP server we didn't recognize, that's going to look like a beacon because it's going to call out about every 15 to 30 minutes. It's going to have the same session size every time. Until we see, oh yeah, that's UDP 123 going to a known NTP server, it's going to look suspicious to us. So when we get to our disposition stage, maybe we go through and say, hey, let's whitelist that bad boy. So that IP talking to that IP over UDP 123, never show me that again. I don't care. Well, think about that. So now my first threat hunt, I had 95,000 systems I was able to get rid of right away. After I add in some whitelists, maybe we get rid of another 2,000 or 3,000 more. Now we've greatly whittled down what we need to work with. So one of the cool things about having a good threat hunting process is if you're constantly feeding back into the system, the first time you do a threat hunt, it might take you 2 days. But the next time it's only going to take you a day. And the next time after that might be 4 hours. Networks that I've gone through and tweaked a whitelist for, I can threat hunt that in an hour or less, easy. So again, it helps to keep making system improvements. It's that whole agile thing that I keep talking about. Now, if we get to the end of this path and the disposition is, hey, I think we've been whacked. I think this box is compromised. Well, this is easy. We hand it off to incident handling mode. Now, if we're in a big company, hey, great, that's another team. Hey, guys, you got to go check out this IP address. Something's wrong with it. If we're a small company, meaning like we are security and IT, we need to now go into a forensics mode and figure out how, or incident handling mode and figure out how we're going to do this, which means we need to have forensic skills. That's a different problem. That's a resource problem. But, again, the end goal is it safe? Is it not? And I find having a scoring system really helps here. We do much better in life when we have solid, achievable metrics, when we have something to kind of run with. I've seen these things kind of get stuck in limbo. I've seen situations where it's, well, there's a persistent connection, but the protocol doesn't look like it's being used. And, it's not using a digital certificate. And, it's easy to just get in this cycle where you're feeling like, yeah, I don't know. I can't, every day's a new day. And I don't know if it's good or bad. And you just never make a decision. If you assign some points to the things you're looking for, that can make it a whole lot easier. So let's say we come up with a scoring system where we say 0 is safe, 0 is I'm 100% certain it's safe, 100 is 100% certain it's compromised, and now we set some trigger thresholds. If the score drops below 10, yeah, I don't need to get to 0, that's fine, and I'm going to ignore it. If it gets above 90, yeah, okay, I'm going to refer that to incident handling because that's suspicious enough it's worth taking a deeper look at what's going on. Well, now we only have the between 10 and 90 range to work with, right? Now if we go in and we assign some points, if we have major modifiers and minor modifiers, it becomes a whole lot easier to run through this. So persistency of connection, that should be one of our major modifiers. That should be a process where, hey, I see an internal system that calls out to an IP address and it's doing it, once per minute, every minute, all day long, every day of the week. Okay, that should add in like 70 points right there. Now, let's say the protocol looks okay. Now we start getting into, minor modifiers, things like if it's using HTTP, is that client signature unique versus the rest of your environment? Because if a client signature is unique and that's the only thing I see wrong, who cares? Every environment has some one-offs. That's part of having a network. But if it's a one-off and it's beaconing, yeah, that makes it more interesting to me. Do I see them moving a lot of data out of the network? That might be worth paying attention to. That's another one from the threat intel side I do pay attention to as well, is if I see like a couple of megabytes or less between an IP address that's on a threat intel list, I don't care. That to me says somebody tried to connect to something and it just wasn't there. Now, if I see, 20 megabytes or 50 megabytes or more data moving to a band IP, yeah, that's something I want to pay attention to. That should kind of fall into my minor modifiers, and maybe the amount of data moved tweaks that score. So if it's, less than a megabyte of data, it adds 1 point. If it's 20 megabytes of data, maybe it adds 20 points. And you get the idea. This is going to be a little different for every environment. It's going to depend on what skills you have, what tools you have, what you're good at finding, what you're not, how best to go about and kind of tweak these scores. But it's fairly easy to go through and kind of figure this thing all out. So one of the final discussions I kind of want to pull in is, do you currently have a threat score system? Do you use something like this? And if so, how do you assign those scores? How do you go through and figure out what puts a lot of weight towards considering something to potentially be in a compromised state, and what only does a minor amount of that? What process do you use as part of doing this? Does this help you reduce that processing time? And again, to go back to what I talked about before with agile and continuous improvement, does this help you identify places in the system where you can actually reduce the amount of time it takes you to go through and do something, whether it be with new tools or new techniques or changing up the process, whatever the case may be? Again, I kind of talked about, here's the order. The order is look for persistent connection, look for abnormal behavior in the protocol, reputation of external IP, then internal IP. That specific order came out of doing many, many, many threat hunts. I'll be honest. I started with the reputation checks. And what I found was I spent an awful lot of wasted time. I spent a lot of time running down things that just didn't matter. So the reason I made changes to this process was, and it's kind of obvious when you think about it, persistent connection. If there's a persistent connection, that is the most important thing. Because if I've got an internal system that sent one packet to a banned IP address, oh my God, who cares? I've got other things to worry about. But if I've got one system communicating to an external IP once every second and I don't know why, oh, that is a whole lot worse than talking to an IP on a threat intel list by a long shot. So again, this process has come out of doing this many, many times for me. Now, I'm recommending it as a process. You might find things work slightly differently for you or slightly change, some tweaks to it. That's awesome. Again, that's part of being agile. It's part of being figuring out what works best in your environment. Is this perfect? Can it catch everything? Am I giving you like the magic medicine that cures all? No, of course not. This doesn't change the fact that security is about defense in depth. It doesn't change the fact about you should never trust one technology and one technology alone to completely secure your environment. Everything has its strengths and weaknesses, and this technique is no different than that. This looks for a C2 channel. Now, when you look at the bad folks out in the internet, whether it be gangs of kids that are trying to make a side hustle or actual nation state APT, the one thing they have in common is they want to gain something out of this. And it might be stealing resources, customer information, processing time, adding to a botnet. There's something they want to go through and grab. Usually that involves a C2 channel. So this technique I'm talking through, anytime a C2 channel is involved, this is going to help you be able to drill in and cut that 6-month response time down dramatically. But not everything has a C2 component to it. If I get physical access to your network and I drop in a box that has a MiFi card in it that, calls up, that creates a connection through Verizon, and I get my data out of your network that way, yeah, you'll never see the C2. Now, you could argue you have a bigger problem if I can walk in and drop that box than just the network connection. But that stuff is going to get missed by this because this assumes C2 is going to go out over the internet. NotPetya is probably the biggest example of something that this would not catch. Now, NotPetya was designed to be a cyber bomb. NotPetya, the gain was to destroy systems. It wasn't to steal information or resources or anything like that. This was let's call a spade a spade. The running story is that Russia launched this against the Ukraine in order to damage as many systems within Ukraine as they possibly could. This was first launched through a Ukrainian tax system that everybody who did business in the Ukraine had to have access to. So they leveraged that box to get NotPetya into everybody that was within the Ukraine. And this didn't have a C2 channel. They didn't need it because this went in, self-propagated, and then destroyed the system on its way out. That would not get detected by this. But like I said, that's an edge case versus what we commonly run into. What we commonly run into is the C2 channel to worry about. So where do we go from here? One of the things that I hope you kind of pull out of this is that we're doing a lot of stuff that's wasting our time. PCI calls out doing system log review, and yet when you look at the data, we're not catching credit card processing systems doing system log review. So all of us are wasting time and money to meet that attestation for absolutely no reason. Now, again, maybe a bigger data set would show something different, but it's just really telling to me because Verizon does a lot of incident response. And for the entire year, they couldn't find a single organization that had their credit card processing compromised that was able to actually catch that themselves doing system log review. So we need to make some changes. We need some better best practices. None of us can do this alone. I think we need to kind of go after this as a team. So part of where this Discord server comes from is to try and be a collection for this type of discussion and for mindsets that want to kind of work through this problem and really kind of drive this forward. So I really hope that the output from this is a lot of this conversation keeps going and we kind of keep hitting it from here. And with that, I am done with the slides. And Shelby, I've been trying to kind of keep up with the channel. I can imagine that I've missed a lot of the questions that may have gone unanswered that have gone by. So I'm gonna, if you have some, please jump in and kind of ask away. I'll also ask folks, if you've asked a question in the Discord channel and it didn't get answered, please feel free to post it in now and I'll go through and kind of hit it.
Chris?
Yes.
How about we get a couple from the GoToWebinar control panel side as well, if you're up for them?
I am totally cool with that.
So we had a couple, and apologies if these are a little bit further back in the webcast, so the context was lost. I apologize for that. How do you, quote, review the integrity of every device? From Clay.
So the concept is, are there any indications of it being in a compromised state? That's really what you're kind of going through and doing there. So it's a looking at how does a system act when it's compromised? Does this show any of those symptoms? So, you know, we're all in isolation right now because there's a pandemic taking place. You know, how do you, as a layperson, figure out if this may be something that affects you, the symptoms? This, you know, if your temperature is at or above 100.4, if you have, you know, congestion, if you have aches, if you have a combination of those symptoms, it doesn't mean definitively you've got this virus, but there's a pretty good indication of that. Now, if you don't have any of those symptoms, you probably don't have the virus. Now, you could be asymptomatic. It's possible, but it's unlikely. And even if you are asymptomatic, you're probably going to show symptoms at some point. This is kind of that same thing. This is we're going in and we're looking for those symptoms of being in the system, quote unquote, being in a sick state to identify whether that's something that needs further attention.
Farshad asks, what's the functional difference between threat hunting and the detection phase in kill chain?
I don't think that it's that different. I think that when you look at from the kill chain perspective, how do I do detection? A lot of people fall back on system log review. What I'm questioning is when we stop and we look at the data says what we're doing today does not work. We need to find different processes. Now, maybe what I'm suggesting here, you know, doesn't work 100% of the time. But is it better than what we're using today? Because if it is, maybe it's something we ought to consider. I see another question in Discord. Let me grab that one real quick before you read off others, Bill. People are expecting to identify this abnormal behavior without a full understanding of the system normal. So I agree with that and I disagree with that. You know, there's a couple of ways you can go about doing this. You can go through and you could, you know, baseline what is normal for the system. And I think that works great in IoT, not so much with desktops or servers because those have a wide variety of functionality that they're going to try and perform. So I'm going to give Bill a plug. Bill wrote a tool called Passer. He's also working on some additional software that does exactly that for like IoT devices, where you can go in and you can say, hey, this thermal sensor sends an HTTPS connection once per minute to this control module, and it does it 24 hours a day, and it sends X amount of data and receives Y amount of data. I can create that as a baseline and look for variations off of that, and that's probably going to be the most accurate way to go through and figure out, is this thing misbehaving? Is it in a bad shape? What I was talking about was looking for C2. You know, this goes beyond that. but I can't necessarily baseline a desktop the same way. So I'll agree that you kind of need to know what is normal, but not necessarily. If you understand normal in general, if you understand like, hey, an HTTPS connection should always start with an SSL hello packet from the client. It should always be followed by an SSLO packet from the server. The digital certificate should always go after that. You understand enough about the HTTPS protocol now to see, hey, somebody's tunneling SSH through TCP 443. Or, hey, the data looks, encrypted or obfuscated, but I didn't see that handshake. Somebody's up to no good. So I don't need to understand if it's normal or not from a system perspective, just from a protocol perspective, and I can apply that across the board. Cool. You got one more, Bill? And then we'll go into after show?
Yeah, let's try this one. Any suggestions for people who have large collections of systems directly connected to the internet without anything but a host firewall? And the addendum is, besides, get a firewall.
Yeah, this is one of the things with 5G that scares the bejesus out of me, is everybody's talking about, oh yeah, let's just give everything a direct connection. And we have that today. A Shodan search on Modbus brings back a scary number of exposed systems. The first time I saw that, my jaw dropped. So yeah, what do you do? What do you do with these things? Part of it kind of comes down to, why is it in this state? Meaning that, why is it fully exposed to the internet? If it's a situation where, yeah, it's on a 4G connection because it's sitting out in a hill someplace and it's a, control system for some industrial piece of equipment, you might not have a whole lot of options beyond trying to get what you can out of the host, unless the device that actually does the connection has some sort of security capability to it as well. If the problem is, oh, it's running in Amazon EC2 or it's running in, Azure, you could actually start collecting that network data without having to put a firewall in front of it to be able to go in and look for this type of activity. Bill just did a great webcast on how to do this in Amazon EC2, and he's doing this as a series. Bill, I don't know if you plan to do Google or Microsoft next. I don't think we've really talked about that, but we do plan on hitting those two environments as well. So that may, that may be a possibility in that type.